Animating SVGs is a super fun way to do web animation. It's something I cover in my workshop, something I do a lot in my work. And one thing that always comes up is how to export and optimize SVGs from Illustrator that you're going to animate. When you're going to animate an SVG, you have slightly different goals than if you just want it to be a nice, small, compact graphic somewhere in your page. So I thought I'd make this short video to show you the export options from Illustrator and the steps I take to get an SVG ready for animation. So there are two ways to save out or to get an SVG out of Illustrator. You can either do the Save As SVG, or you can do the Export As SVG. Export As is only available in some of the newer versions of Illustrator, but if you have that option, I would definitely recommend using the Export over the Save. The Export As just gives you slightly cleaner output, kind of leaves off some extra stuff that the Save As has. If you have an older version of Illustrator and Save As is your only option, don't worry. If you use an external optimizer for your SVG, all of those extra things can be cleaned up later. So once you pick Export, you want to come down here and say that you want to export as SVG, which is of course at the bottom and out of view on my screen, but that's okay. We'll select SVG, then we hit Export, and we're ready to go. So this is Illustrator's SVG Export Options panel, where you can pick the various ways your code is exported to fit what you want it to be or what works best for you. Sometimes this might be based on what's in the file, and other times it's just based on personal preference of what you prefer to work with. The first one is concerned with how the CSS for your SVG file will be presented within your SVG file. A little hard to say, but it makes a lot more sense when you look at it. So the first option is internal CSS, which will essentially give you something that looks like this, where you'll have a style block here, set of style tags, and all the CSS that has to do with your SVG in there. The class names are made up by Illustrator. They're just kind of numbered and they don't have a lot of meaning. But if you want your styles to be in one place, for example, maybe you're going to copy and paste these into an external CSS, or maybe you're just going to delete them all because you're overriding them all, that's a time when you might want to do this internal CSS. It tends to be the one that I use most often because I'll usually copy and paste this into my external CSS or the rest of the CSS for that page or that document. Inline styles is just like inline style for HTML elements or anything else. It will just add a style attribute to the individual SVG elements with the CSS in there. I tend to never use this one. The last one on this list is presentation attributes, and that means that there really won't be any CSS exactly in your SVG file. Instead of defining these attributes in CSS, they'll be defined as actual attributes on the SVG elements. So for example, instead of having your strokes defined in CSS, you'll have a stroke value on the actual SVG path or rectangle or circle or whatever else you have. I tend to use this option if I know I will never be changing these in the CSS or in the animation or anything. If I know that like, hey, this triangle is yellow and I am never going to change it, I might go with the presentation attributes because then it's just kind of there and out of the way. Our second set of options is all about fonts, which is a pretty fun one and pretty powerful one, really. Our two options here are either having the font be SVG, which would mean you'd have live text in your SVG, and that can use like a web font that's embedded in your HTML document and all those kinds of things. You can use real fonts with real text. The other option is to convert your font to outlines. Of course, in this file, I have no text, so this option has no bearing on this particular file. But if I did have text, convert to outlines would just make each letter an individual shape. It would no longer be live text. It wouldn't be something that could be read. It would just be the outlines of the letter shapes. Sometimes convert to outlines gives you a smaller file size. Sometimes the SVG fonts gives you, or the live fonts of the setting of SVG gives you a smaller file size. There's not one that always equals a smaller file size. That's really kind of a call you need to make on a case-by-case basis. The third one covers how any images in your SVG might be handled. You can either embed the image. If you had some kind of rasterized image in your SVG, you could embed it or you can link it. And I'll link to some articles in the description that go into a bit more detail on what those do exactly. Haven't ever used that for an SVG I'm animating before. The object ID setting is something that is actually only in the Export As dialog, not in the Save As dialog. I tend to always have this set on layer names, mostly because, I just went through and named all of my layers, things that are meaningful to me, and I've named the layers I know I'll be accessing to animate and all that kind of stuff. I kind of want Illustrator to use them. There are two other options here. There's minimal and unique, which essentially give you meaningless to humans but very short names for all your layer IDs. If you're animating things, I feel like either of these, either minimal or unique, would make your job harder. Layer names is the only thing that would make your job easier. And of course, these are only really helpful if you've actually named your layer meaningful things. If you have like 50 things called layer 1 through 50, layer names really aren't going to help you. The last kind of write-in setting we have is the number of decimal points, and this is the number of decimal points that will be used in any of the numbers that define like the individual points or shape of an SVG path, the X and Y coordinates of where something will be drawn, all of those things. The fewer decimal places you have, the smaller the file size will be, and the easier it will be to read as like a human. There are some trade-offs here though. If your file is very small dimension-wise, like let's say you're dealing with an icon that's maybe only 20 pixels by 20 pixels, if you have very complex shapes in that small amount of space, you may need more decimal places to accurately represent those shapes. So sometimes this is kind of like a see how it works sort of thing. I usually leave mine at 1 to see what happens, and if for any reason things look funny when I export them, I might increase this decimal number just to get accurate representation of the shapes that I'm exporting. There's 2 last little checkboxes here, one for minifying, which I would not recommend checking if you're going to animate this. That will make your SVG pretty much impossible to read. And the last one is responsive. If you check the responsive box, no width and height will be defined in your SVG itself, or at least Illustrator won't define a width and height for you. It's a pretty easy one to reverse if you have it checked or unchecked and meant to have the other. Once we've gone through all of those, Illustrator lets us go straight to seeing the SVG code. You just click Show Code and it opens up this text file showing you exactly what it's going to export. From here, I would usually just copy all of this code, and I can either from here paste it into like a code pen or an HTML file, wherever I'm going to use this SVG. But most of the time, I would probably take this and head over to an external SVG optimizer like SVG OMG. SVG OMG isn't the only SVG optimizer out there, but it's the one that works best for the way I work, so it's the one I use. Once you have SVG OMG open in your browser, you can actually just paste in that exported code, that same markup that Illustrator exported. You can paste it right here into the paste markup field. Once you do that, you get a visual representation of your SVG, which hopefully matches what you saw in Illustrator. If not, kind of a problem, but this one does, so we're in good shape. And there's also this code tab where you can see the actual code you're optimizing, which is pretty handy. This is usually what I have open while I'm optimizing my SVGs. Now with the cleaner export that we're getting from Illustrator these days, there isn't usually a lot I need to change from the default settings of SVG OMG. There's just a couple of settings here that I want to point out because they can really affect how easy or hard it might be to animate this SVG. The first one is the Prettyify code. You definitely want to keep this on if you're planning on animating this SVG. This is the prettyfied version right now, pretty easy to read, easy to find my IDs and whatever else. If I turn it off, all the white space is gone and this becomes really difficult to read. You might be able to do this afterwards once you've finished with the animation, but while you're actually working on it, it's not a really fun way to work. The second setting is the shapes to smaller paths. If you'll notice right now in my SVG, I have a couple of rectangles here, and these are actually, shapes within my SVGs that are rectangles, and they're defined in a very specific way that rectangles are. If I turn this setting on, those rectangles get changed into paths. And the way they're represented, they still are going to look like rectangles. They'll look exactly the same, but the way they're represented in the code here in my SVG is a little bit different. Most of the time, this probably will make no difference, but there might be times, depending on what you're planning to animate, when you really do need those to be rectangles and not paths. So keep an eye out for this setting if you actually need specific kinds of shapes in your SVG to make the animation work. One last setting to bring to your attention is the remove title. Right now it's on, but if I turn it off, my title returns. My title is not very meaningful, but yours might be, and you might want it there for accessibility reasons. So if it disappears, just go and turn that setting off. Of course, it's also one that's fairly easy to add in later if you, check the wrong setting here. So once I have everything looking good in SVG OMG, I will just copy and paste this SVG code again. And take this SVG into CodePen or whatever HTML document I'm going to be using it in to animate it. There is also a button here to download your SVG image file if you want to, keep tabs on that as well. And then one final step, once I've got the SVG in CodePen or wherever I'll be animating it, I go through and just kind of clean up the classes that Illustrator made. Kind of clean up these ones like the CLS one, rename them in a way that's meaningful for me, take this, style block and put it into my actual CSS. And I often change my IDs that Illustrator gives me to classes as well. Most of the time, I prefer to work with it that way, but that's just kind of like an individual preference kind of thing. So that's my approach for exporting and optimizing SVGs for animation. I hope you found something useful in there for your workflow too. If you want to learn more about animating SVGs, check out the workshops that I'm running with Sarah Drasner this year. You can find all the full details of what we teach and where we're going to be with them at webanimationworkshops.com. Thanks for watching.